I love animals and I don't particularly love zoos. I know that in a city with the oldest and arguably one of the finest zoos in the country, this could be considered an impolitic thing to say, but it's true and there's a point to this confession. I remember years ago visiting a zoo, seeing a somewhat stringy lion let out an anemic roar, and what was going through my head must have come out of my mouth because my friend Sherry quickly corrected me. She said, "That lion was born in captivity. He wouldn't last 1 week on the savannah. If he's going to live, this is where it's going to have to be. Besides," she said, "zoos aren't like they were in the old days. This is an educational institution." And of course, she's right. A few years later, we were in Scotland, just north of Oban, on our way to Iona, and Sherry said to me, "There's a sea lion sanctuary on the way. I'd really like to stop and see what they're doing." And again, my anti-zoo sentiment reared its head. I said, "Sherry, I really don't want to watch a bunch of poor sea lions swimming around in circles in some tepid puddle." And again, I was justifiably corrected. "It's a rescue sanctuary," she said. "The injured pups are brought here and fed until they come up to weight, and then they are released back out into the wild. They've been tracking their work for years. They have a 90% success rate. It's not a zoo. But if anything, it's a new kind of zoo." I thought about this last week as I reconsidered Isaiah's zoo, because in each instance, the reality was markedly different from what I could see. That is the heart of Isaiah's vision, that nothing is as it seems. Nothing is the way we expect it to be. Honestly, that's the magic of Isaiah's vision, that nothing is as we expect it to be, because, let's be honest, lions and lambs do not hang out together. Not for very long, at least. Same with the leopards and the kids. You can put them together, but you'll probably have a very nice pair of gloves at the end of the day. I've never seen a grazing bear. Maybe you remember that wonderful Edward Hicks folk painting that hangs in the National Gallery, the one called The Peaceable Kingdom. It shows up on Christmas cards a lot this time of year. It is Isaiah's vision come to life. There is a rather possum-like bear hanging out next to a cow who is gnawing on some straw. There is another cow standing next to a regal, restrained, elegantly serene lion. And in the midst of it all is a toddler. We don't put toddlers in zoo enclosures either, come to think of it. The whole thing looks like a farce. Isaiah's listeners would have thought that vision was pretty farcical too. Most of us encounter the word prophecy and assume, at least part of the time, that it is made up of prognostication, a look ahead to some sort of distant future. Let's be honest, in the church, many of us hear the words of Isaiah and we race right ahead to Jesus. Jesus is many hundreds of years into the future from when Isaiah was preaching. And whatever we think that Isaiah has to say about Jesus, he starts with a word to his people about their situation right then. Isaiah was preaching a present word to a present reality. The book of the prophet Isaiah, I've told you before, was written over many years through three distinctive and chaotic times in the life of God's people. First, he comes with a warning. It is long and it is verbose, but at the heart of it is a quite simple message to the people. If you stay on this path, then there will be consequences. The path, of course, is placing their trust in anything other than the living God. Then Isaiah turns his focus to their present reality. They have failed to change course. The consequences have come, and now they are living with them. And finally, many years later, Isaiah provides a word of promise to God's people. God has not forgotten those who are in exile, but has promised to return them to their homes. Whatever their present suffering, it will not go on forever. And what I find so wonderful about Isaiah, though, is this. In every age of his prophecy, whether it is the time of warning or the time of resignation to their present circumstances, or even the end looking forward to an eventual promise, there remains throughout Isaiah's prophecy a thread that runs all the way through. It is a thread of hope. Our reading this morning, the absurd vision of the peaceable kingdom, wherein logic is stood on its head with unpredictable animal behavior, is just such a word of hope. It begins simply enough. A root shall come out of the stump of Jesse. Now, in the scenes before this portion of the prophecy, Isaiah has laid out a description of what is coming. And what he has described for the people of Israel is what amounts to the utter deforestation of the landscape. Every living thing will be cut down and thrown as fuel into the fire. John the Baptist came by that vision honest. If you stay on this path, then there will be consequences. And even in seemingly hopeless circumstances, when God knows the path God's people will take, even then, God leaves the element of hope in the heart of Isaiah's prophecy. Why? Because God is God. Even in the midst of a promise of rampant destruction, there is that line that hearkens back to better days. It looks back to the past and forward to the future. A root shall come out of the stump of Jesse. You know, we read that in our minds, I'm sure for a great many of us, particularly this time of year, we hear that and we race ahead to Jesus. But those listeners to Isaiah's word would have raced backward. They raced back to David, back to a happier time, a time filled with promise, a time when they knew that God was not done with them. All that we may see presents one reality, but God has a different vision sometimes. Perhaps God has a different vision all the time. I read this past week of a recording that was made by the artists Simon and Garfunkel in the 1960s. It is an art piece designed to make a point. They recorded the hymn Silent Night against the acoustic backdrop of the Vietnam War. And so against the melodic strains of the song were heard the staccato punctuation of gunshots. Their point was clear, that the specter of war slashes at the salvific strains of the hymn. The reality of war and death wipes out the warm candlelight glow we associate with this carol, reducing it to a fairy tale. But as I thought about that piece, I began to wonder, is there another way to hear it? What if we reverse the way we look at it? What if the strains of the carol instead wash over the sounds of the gunshot, presenting instead a new vision, their vision of the world that is to come? As I explored this idea, I began to wonder how our present world stacks up against the vision of the peaceable kingdom. So I decided to go and look at a variety of different newspapers to see what I could ascertain about the state of the world these days. I went in each of them and I just looked at their headlines, and I ignored the ones that reference the chaos of our political life. But I started with the Philadelphia Inquirer, where I read that a local representative is resigning from the state legislature after embezzling $500,000 from her own charity. Then I turned to the New York Times, and the headline that jumped out at me there: climate change is accelerating, things are getting worse. Next, I turned to the Wall Street Journal, where I encountered the story of a man who rescued his family from ISIS only to lose them to the civil war in Syria. The Washington Post was no better. Once I scrolled past all the impeachment coverage, all I was left with was Kim Jong-un. That was Wednesday. It's enough to make us all feel sometimes a little like John the Baptist. Isaiah's peaceable kingdom seems all the more far away and unreachable. I don't know about you, but I need a new zoo. I need a different vision of reality. I need the hymns and carols of the season to play over what we see and present their alternate story of redemption. Because the heart of the gospel is always redemption. And the whole Bible is God's story of hope. That's why the hope runs all the way through Isaiah, because God has a different vision. God can see what can yet be, even when we are yet unable to see it. Walter Brueggemann writes, "The Old Testament voices the oldest, deepest, most resilient grounding in hope in all of human history. Yahweh has sworn to effect futures of well-being that are beyond the present condition of the world and that cannot in any credible way be extrapolated from the present." That is the hope of the gospel, that when things are just about as bad as they can possibly be, when things are as bad as a Messiah strung up to a cross, that God is never done. That's the promise of the gospel. that the hope of God never dries up, that God can and God will create a new reality, a vision even as absurd as the peaceable kingdom. You know, for most of us, when our lives are going great, we don't give too much thought to how to find a hopeful future, do we? Maybe for one or two of us, or three or four of us, life is hard this time of year. The loneliness creeps in. Maybe for a handful of us, or more than a handful, the commercialization of Christmas has gotten to us so deeply that we're in danger of seeing it as just one more expense, something to be gotten through as painlessly as possible. Or maybe you are grieving. Holidays are hard when you are mourning. I think perhaps the hardest of all. The good news of the gospel says, don't give up. Don't give up. There's a new zoo coming. Don't give up, because from the shreds of what could have been, God puts together a new creation again and again and again and again, as long as it takes. That is what redemption is. It is God taking what is and making it into what can be. I love a story that Anne Lamott tells in her book, Stitches. After her dog, Bodie, shredded 2 sets of curtains defending her against an unknown threat, either an assassin or the postman, she was left with 2 curtains that were perfectly fine in their upper portions and absolutely ripped to pieces below, where her dog had leapt through them, ultimately sort of wearing them like the tutu-wearing hippos of Fantasia. She writes that she took them to her friend to see what could be made of them. 2 tops of curtains, no bottoms, and a seamstress. She writes, she wondered if the 2 tops could be mated, and ended up taking them home with her to see what she could do. This is all that restoration requires much of the time, that one person not give up. After telling the story of her friend's creative work, she concludes, the newly sewn curtain was fabulous and crazy, whereas before it had been logical and tranquil. Now it was one wild lake of designs. Once it was 2 torn up curtains, and now it was a whole, although a whole with issues. Beauty is a miracle of things going together imperfectly. What might have been thrown out was taken from tattered scraps to something majestic and goofy and honest that holds together and that keeps people's eyes off of me and my family and yet lets in the light and the sun like a poem or a song. And she concludes, you have to keep taking the next necessary stitch, and the next one, and the next. Without stitches, you just have rags. God's vision of the peaceable kingdom persists. If the appearance of John the Baptist in the wilderness preaching repentance says anything, it says that God is not yet done. There is an expectation of redemption. And with that expectation of redemption comes into all the chaos of the world, whispers of hope and the constant calling that we will take part in this wild kingdom that is not yet here. And how better can we contribute than to pick up the pieces we have around us and start stitching the world back together into the colorful and crazy new pattern that even now God is dreaming up.